I think John's going to start with a roll call to make sure everyone can hear everyone else.
I'm John Keeler. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
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 Harold
Yes.
Seaholtz,
Yes.
present, and we can hear you. Roger Root,
Present.
thank you. Dan Pizarro,
Present.
present. Dan McEwen,
Present.
all members are present and accounted for. We'll call the meeting to order. Those joining us by Zoom by name inquire if they hear and vice versa. If there is an issue, stop the meeting, please hold. No issues, continue the meeting. We seem to be on track. First item will be Pledge of Allegiance. I believe Darrell will lead us in that this evening.
All right.
Came prepared.
Pledge of allegiance to the flag, United
United States of America,
to the republic,
which
which
is
stands
One nation.
nation,
under
God,
God,
indivisible.
Liberty, justice for
liberty,
all.
liberty,
justice for all.
justice for all.
Thank you. Again of note, it's census time, 2020 census time. Everybody, please fill out your census forms online at 2020census.gov. Next item of business is approval of the minutes of the May 12th, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. Having read and reviewed those minutes, are there any corrections or additions? Hearing none, I'll look for a motion to pass as written.
I'll make a motion that the Planning Commission meeting minutes for May 12th, 2020 be approved as written.
We have a motion before us. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye and raise your hand. Aye.
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 Approved by all. Item 5, old business. A, none at this time. 6, new business. Commercial redevelopment overlay district petition. Hearing before the Board of Supervisors scheduled for July 20th, 2020 at 5 o'clock. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name's Mark Stanley. I'm a partner with McNeese Wallace and Nurick and represent the applicant Rockvale Acquisition LLC. With me tonight is Chris Vanarchek from RGS Associates. RGS is the project land planner, and also Isaac Massery. Isaac is a principal and representative of the applicant Rockvale Acquisition LLC. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to seek the Planning Commission's recommendation for the approval and adoption of the proposed commercial redevelopment overlay district. As some background, the applicant is the record owner of the shops at Rockvale, approximately 65 acres in size and zone C3. From a chronological perspective, wow, the world's changed since the last time we were in front of the Planning Commission. In February of this year, we made a proposal to the Planning Commission and discussed generally the content of the commercial overlay district regulations. At that point in time, we were talking about the significant effects that e-commerce was having on the retail industry in Lancaster County and across the nation. And we told the Planning Commission that we would take its comments into consideration. informally go to the Board of Supervisors, receive their comments, work with staff, including your manager and Tara Hitchens, and then formally submit our petition. And that's exactly what we've done. We formally submitted the petition in April 15th. But since then, in addition to the effect of e-commerce, COVID-19 has hit us hard. I think we went in February being proactive, a little proactive, trying to get out ahead of this. Now to where we are being very, very much in a reactive mode because of the devastating effects that both e-commerce and now COVID has had on the retail industry. Generally, I'm not going to reiterate unless the Planning Commission would like a more in-depth presentation, because I think we talked a lot about what we're proposing and what's contained in the petition that's been submitted. What I would like to emphasize is some of the changes that was made to the petition and the draft ordinance between February and when we presented it in April. Some of the changes include increasing the percentage of vacancy from 25 to 35%, adding a few additional uses to the overlay district, including grocery stores and parking compounds, including a minimum residential density. We initially discussed incorporating certain protections so the commercial would not necessarily be overridden by the residential component. And those stopgaps included no more than 40% of the site and an upward density limit of 12 units per acre. At staff's recommendation, we've included a minimum density of 4 units per acre. We also discussed reducing the impervious coverage from 80 to 70, but having flexibility to increase that 70% coverage, simply providing that we could demonstrate that the additional coverage can be addressed through the stormwater. At the Planning Commission's recommendation, we added bike facilities and connections, and also as part of the master plan, some sample renderings of proposed building and architectural themes. As we discussed then and now, we're looking at this as a test case to see if this works, not only under the conditions that we're proposing, and that is frontage on Route 30, 50 or more acres, and a vacancy rate. But if it would work, and that's one of the things that the Lancaster County Planning Commission has recommended, they voted yesterday to unanimously support the adoption of this proposed ordinance. Their suggestion would be that the township consider in the future expanding the conditions under which this would apply, so it would apply to other tracks and potentially other shopping centers. With that, Chris, Isaac, and myself would be more than happy to answer any questions the Planning Commission has. We would simply like to reiterate that we do now, in our experience, a significant urgency in moving this matter forward, not only to keep in line with what we're proposing. The Board of Supervisors has a public hearing on July 20th, but to allow us to move forward with our planning, to pull potential developers, potential tenants, and different uses to this site. One thing I would like to add and maybe close with, shortly after we attended the meeting of the informal meeting with the Board of Supervisors, the Bronx Police Fire Chief, a gentleman by the name of Dave Gribble, sent an email to Tara Hitchens and Ralph Hutchinson supporting the proposal, indicating that he was very much in favor of what was being proposed and would look forward to working with the applicant in redeveloping this site.
Thank you, Mark. I have a few things I'd like to cover. Does anybody else have anything they want to cover on the ordinance?
I have some too, but I can wait for you, John.
Yeah, I have a couple things.
Okay. So most of us have a little something. Darrell, do you want to start?
Yes. I've read through it, guys, and I like it. I'm supportive of it. Commend you for the work you did. I tend to be the nitpicky, so I have a couple things to speak to. With the petition to amend, you make reference to the comp plan and the places 2040, but there is no reference to the Route 30 streetscape, which is a key plan as well for that area. And I had that comment, and I noticed that is a comment from the county in their draft review comments. Now, we've not seen the final approval that you just referenced occurred yesterday, but they had made reference that there should be some reference to the Route 30 streetscape. I think that's a critical part of the township's planning efforts. So if that could be added somewhere down, probably 11 or a new 12, and move it down, because 10 is the comp plan, 11 is places 2040. That's actually all I had on the petition. I don't know if you want me to go on, or does anybody else have anything on the petition?
Well, I just had some questions on the ordinance. Yeah, when they talked about the 35% gross retail sales is for the minimum. How did you come up with that figure? Are we just pulling something out, or is it something going? I just didn't know if that's you're pulling some straws here.
I don't think we were just pulling something out of thin air. We were looking potentially, and I think initially, at economic impacts. And when you have a center the size of this, and the initial ordinance or draft of the ordinance referenced vacancies of 25%. When you start having shopping centers that have dark spaces and vacancies of up to 25%, economically, you run into situations where bad follows bad. And dark stores turn into further dark stores. There was no economic study done, but we looked at a percentage, and staff made a recommendation that we did not push back on to increase that vacancy. But it's been, I think, the experience of the development team that once you get to a certain percentage of dark storefronts, then that has a tendency to accelerate. And while there's no magic in that 25, now 35%, we thought it was significant enough from an economic perspective to, if we're looking to change the overall mix of the site, that there would be a significant vacancy And therefore, we saw a need in opening up these additions.
Yeah, 35% seemed a little high to me, but then you also had the 6 months time period there. So I guess, a company wouldn't be encouraged to shut down some stores just to be able to do something like this, because of it, just to get up to a certain percentage, it was going to be costing them money for that period of time. But yeah, I just wondered where that 35% came from.
This is Roger. I have a question about the housing density. It seems quite a range from 4 units to 12. So how did that number? That seems a big stretch. So because my feeling is if we're going to do something with an alternative plan for this site, I'd like to see a higher residential component here rather than a range from 4 to 12. Is it because of the design, or where the residential may end up on the site, or what am I not understanding about the range of those numbers?
Chris, do you want to address that?
Yeah, when we looked at the density, we were trying to understand what makes sense on the property in terms of its proximity to, say, Lancaster City, where it is along the corridor, what are some of the initiatives of the county. For example, some of the initiatives of the county are at least 8 dwelling units per acre. So when we're looking at a mixed use component, we're thinking probably apartments, market rate apartments. And we talked about potentially townhouses. So we want to have that flexibility to introduce multiple types of dwellings to allow for affordability, varying levels of affordability and different styles of homes. So 12 units per acre. I mean, we do have that cap where it says only a maximum of 40% of the total acreage can be devoted to a residential use. And the mixed use component, the idea is to bring those rooftops right on property with that retail, because that's what's happening today with some of these retail centers is they're ailing because they just don't have customers nearby. We have to try to make this a destination. That's some of the things we had talked about in the last meeting. So how do we do that? Well, we try to bring as much residential as we possibly can. However, recognizing that this is a corridor. So we want the commercial component to be a large portion of that, which in this case, it's 60% of that mix on the property. As far as the lower range, the 4 acres, if I'm not mistaken, Mark, I believe that was a request of township staff and talking to them that they wanted to see that minimum density. So that's how we arrived at that number.
I had a question on that too. When you say the 4%, does that mean that maybe you have 12% in 1 acre and then maybe 4% on another adjacent acre in this whole development, but it all balances out to 8% or something in that? Or is that what we're seeing here? I agree with Roger. It wasn't clear to me what you were stating here.
Well, I think
We weren't, go ahead, Chris. We weren't talking percentages. We were talking units per acre. So that distinction should be made right up front. From a density perspective, the original proposal was a maximum density of 12 units per acre over the entire site, but with a limitation of no more than 40%, no more than 40% of the site, and that's where the percentage comes in, could be used for residential purposes. And Chris, you're correct. It was a suggestion by the staff that if there was a maximum density, there should be a minimum density, potentially to encourage more of the more dense development, the townhouse development, the multifamily development that we're envisioning, as opposed to potentially eating up ground for purposes of single family detached development.
So
How,
the point of this, I'm sorry, Errol, go ahead.
how does this, and I recall that you just said, Mark, like before it was 12 units per acre for the total acreage. which means on a given acre, you might have 15 or 20. But now we're saying it's 12 per the 40% gross acreage. But will there be any mixed use? Will there be any residential or housing above, say, first floor commercial? How does that work here with this designation? Or doesn't it address that? I mean, we potentially could have residential and commercial on the same footprint.
That's a possibility, but not a mandatory requirement.
Okay.
One of the things that we sought to achieve with this ordinance is both flexibility and then being able to react to the industry and specifically some of the requirements that are unique to Lancaster County. I think the Planning Commission and staff are familiar with some of the examples outside of Lancaster County where you have the residential over the commercial. But I think it's both Chris's experience and mine that has not yet been extremely successful in Lancaster County to force residential over commercial. So this ordinance does not mandate it. It permits it. It is a possibility with the ordinance that is suggested. But the caps that we worked into this, working with staff and comments that we received were twofold. One, the upper density of the 12 units per acre, and then a percentage of the overall tract that could be developed for residential purposes.
Okay. Where in the ordinance does it specifically allow for the mixed use? Or is that just possible by not being addressed?
I
don't want to have it misinterpreted, reading it one way versus the other. If you put residential over a commercial area, are you counting that as part of the 40%? Or is that commercial and not counted as part of the 40%, which I want the flexibility and I want the clarity to allow for the flexibility without being an exception or a question that would give you the ability to do that option.
It is not specifically addressed, which says that you can or you cannot. It is, I think, just written into the overall context of the ordinance.
Dan, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, the Manheim Township has a mixed use up there on, I think, Fruitville Pike and East Petersburg Road or wherever that is. I can't think of the name of the development right now where there's homes above the stores, I believe. What kind of density are they talking about there, or what do they have to do to allow that in their zoning ordinance? You know,
Chris, are you? I know the development that he's talking about, but I don't know the specifics as to the density or the permitted density with respect to that specific development.
Yeah, well, there they did have houses above or residences above stores, so it is being done in Lancaster County, and I just wonder, was it successful there? Yeah, and what did they do to make it so that I would like to see more of that, increasing density where we can and getting, like Daryl said, residences above commercial uses and that type of thing. So we're using the land more efficiently. And I'm sorry, Isaac, if I jumped on you.
We did work on a project in Warwick Township where we looked at residential commercial use with Newport Square, just outside of Lidditz. And I can tell you that was a project. It was a struggle for that developer to fill those units. The great example of it is across the street where your typical apartments that filled up very quickly. But that apartment building was brought up to the streetscape, so it had a nice feel to it along the main drive. This is Oak Street in Warwick Township. Then across the street, where we had the commercial with the residences above, they just had a very difficult time using that product. So I think back to Mark's point, we certainly want to allow for that. We understand like the concept and the feel that we're trying to achieve when you put that residential above commercial. We didn't want it to be mandatory or quantify it, because it becomes a very difficult challenge for the developer to make it work, because the market, there's a very small percentage of people who have the interest in living above the commercial in I'll say again, like Mark said, Lancaster County, compared to say the outskirts of Philadelphia or Baltimore or Washington, D.C., where it has more of that urban feel. They're much more successful there. In Lancaster County, it can work, but I think it's a very small percentage.
Chris, I had a quick follow-up question for you, and this falls back to one of the earlier questions that was asked about the percentage of residential in the community. So help me clarify this in my mind. If the entire site was 1 story, every building on the site was 1 story, and up to 40% of all the buildings there were residential, that's what's in the plan. If then we started adding second floor residential to that, would that then increase the total residential in the community, or would it still stay at 40% if we're based everything on a 1-story allotment, or are you going by square footages of all the different floors of the buildings?
To provide an answer to that, Dan, it's a good question. I think there might be some confusion on the percentage of residential compared to dwelling units. So the way the ordinance is written, it says a maximum of 40% of the total acreage of the shopping center may be designated for residential use. So to break that down, if this is 63 acres, which is about 63 to 65 acres across this property, no more than 40% of that acreage can be solely residential. So if we do that math, that 40% of 63 is 25 acres. So of 25 acres, you could have a maximum density of 12 units per acre. So that would be 300 units.
Okay.
And the idea, again, I think it's just to establish that this is a commercial corridor. We didn't want to have the overlay allow for residential and have a developer come in and say, you know what, I just want to do all commercial. I know I can do residential, but I just want to do all commercial. That defeats the purpose of this mixed use. We wanted to have some kind of quantifiable control, that 40%. With mixed use, you need to introduce residential. And it's obviously to the benefit of the developer and the success of this community, or this, I should say, this shopping center, to introduce that residential component, because again, then you're putting customers right on the property.
Question. You said the 40% was about 25 acres. I thought Mark said earlier that the density of between 4 and 12 are for the total acreage.
That's right. That's right. So
you're taking 12, you could take 12 times the 63 acres?
Well, yeah, back to Dane's point, we're saying that it's saying that a maximum of 40% of the property can be devoted to residential. But when you're looking at dwelling units per acre, you are looking at the entire property. So I suppose in theory, you could take the entire 63 acres and do 12 units per acre to arrive at roughly 720 dwelling units.
720 on that 25 acres.
No, it could be spread across the entire tract, but we just have to make the math work. So we have to not only hit the maximum dwelling units, we also have to show the quantified area that the maximum area devoted specifically to residential is no more than 40%.
Which is 25 acres.
Correct. Correct. But
So you could have your 700 and some units on that 25 acres.
That is correct.
Yeah, I guess you could. Correct. Yes.
I mean, or
Yeah.
less.
Yeah, that's going pretty vertical, but yes, it's possible.
Well, if you only have so much base square footage. So if you're putting more units in, you have to go up.
Correct.
And we didn't want to turn a commercial district into a residential district. And therefore, we decided there were 2 necessary stopgaps. One, the amount of total acreage on the site that could be used for residential purposes. And then, which is typical for any district, a density limitation. And so the density and the percentage of the site is over the overall site. So as you indicated, you look at 40% of 63, which is about 26 acres, or 23 acres if I was doing my math right. You could go up to 23 acres for residential purposes. And then with those 23 acres on how you slice and dice that, you could have up to 700 units, but that would require the use of multifamily and to go vertical and to utilize the maximum on the site. But those are the upward limitations that we discussed both in February and that are incorporated into our proposed ordinance.
Thank you.
Mark, when you got 40% of the total gross area is residential, and what's the percentage for commercial and open space? I mean, you're breaking out different, is it 60% for commercial and 0 for everything else? Or is there something else in there that we need to be calculating in there too?
We need to provide for the open space. And again, keep in mind that these are, the residential is a maximum. It could be less than the 40%, could be less than the 23 acres. And what it does is that it necessitates a mix of different uses. If you're going to do purely commercial, you're not going to use the overlay. You're simply going to use the underlying zoning district, because we should all keep in mind that we're not rezoning this site. We're simply providing for this overlay that applies in situations when you have more than 50 acres. It is zone C3. It is fronting on Route 30 and you have a vacancy. So if you wanted to simply develop this site for commercial purposes, you would do so under the existing zoning. If you want to take the advantage of the redevelopment option that we've suggested, this, similar to a floodplain district that comes down on top, is an option that's available if the conditions are met.
I guess my other thought is that if what you say and what they're saying about the future and shopping and everything, we might want to consider even more residential and less commercial as a possibility. I don't know. You guys done the studies and everything, but it seems to be that's the way it's going. Everybody's doing shopping online, and I think we're definitely going to be heading that way more so in the future.
Mr. Root, do you have any comments or questions?
The residential dwellings, I mean, the design of those, would any of those include garages and things like that that might appeal to a segment that doesn't want to park their cars along streets or roads, things like that? I mean, what sort of mixed design would you have available for a residential side?
Chris?
Well, I don't know that we specifically call that out in the ordinance. I think what Mark said earlier is we want to be careful not to be too restrictive. It is an overlay, so we want to provide for flexibility. I often reference back to the King of Prussia Town Center, I think we spoke about at the last meeting, where you have condominiums, you have apartments, you have 55 plus, and it really depends on variety and what the developer or the builders want to offer to the market. So we want to be careful not to dictate that.
Okay.
You know, I can't answer that question as to what percentage of people who would choose to live on this site in the township would want a garage, but I imagine there's a mix. So that's where I think the developer needs that flexibility to kind of test that, to see what percentage of the units that he offers offers a garage.
And we did add parking compounds and structured parking, so there's a specific opportunity to use that type of parking facility. But in some respects, the flexibility that we're seeking is tied back to the master plan, which is the first step before a subdivision or land development plan could come in. And what that does is it allows the developer to come in, throw that master plan concept down on the table, have the open discussion between the Planning Commission, the Board of Supervisors, let the township know what our studies are showing and what we're proposing to do with the site, and have that give and take. And then the master plan is binding on the applicant, specifically if it relates to any changes that we're looking to do to the streetscape. I know that Daryl had mentioned the streetscape plan. It is indirectly referenced in the ordinance, which indicates that if there are changes to the master plan that affect the streetscape along Route 30, knowing the history of the streetscape plan that the township has worked on and has really created public-private partnerships up and down the stretch, that if there's any changes there, we've got to come back, we've got to change the master plan before we could proceed with any type of development that would be inconsistent with it.
I have another question back to the density thing, and Tara, maybe you can answer this. I don't know if she's hearing me or not, but what is the county's recommendation or what we're looking for in the overall plan? Is it 7% or 9%? I don't remember what we're looking for as the density that we're ideally looking for in growth areas.
The growth area density from balance was 7.5 units in urban growth areas. And that's an average now. So some areas will be higher, like the city, and other areas would be lower because you're averaging throughout the entire growth area.
I guess that's what I'm trying to get at is we want to be shooting for, that type of density, percentage overall in this at least. So it's just something, the 4 dwelling units per acre is the minimum. I just don't know if we put that in there, is that going to hurt us in meeting that goal?
Yeah, I think the thought on a minimum was that if there was simply a maximum, then it could go even less than that. And we didn't want to waste the land that has services.
Okay, is our minimum too low? I guess my question to that is, should we be looking at a minimum of 6% or something? Yeah.
You mean 6 units per acre, Dan?
6 units, right? Yeah, I'm sorry. The 4 units just seem low to me. If we're trying to achieve a higher density and fill in these areas, and that's what our overall goal is. 4 dwelling units per acre seems low. The 12 seems to be in line because it's when you average it all out, you're going to get to that 7 to 10%. But the 4 units, I think, it could possibly mean that we'll never achieve it in there.
Okay, trying to continue. Roger, do you have any other questions?
Do not, thanks.
Okay, Dan Baswara, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good for right now.
Okay, I have a.
If I may, John? Back with an earlier comment you made, Mark, excuse me, John, that this is an overlay. So if they were just doing commercial development, it would use the commercial development ordinance specifics that are there now in place. So the intent of this is to allow flexibility, and I'm with that and understand that, but conceivably, if I understood you correctly, if somebody comes in with 1% residential, they could use the overlay and not use the current C3 ordinance. So I guess where I'm going is, do we need, the intent is here to have some mixed use and to reuse this commercial site that is underutilized with flexibility to develop it as you talked in the beginning. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. We want to be able to move quickly with what the next need is, which we may or may not know. But do we want to have a mixed use minimum for residential? You know, yes, we're saying 40% maximum. So this is a commercial site, but so that we don't get, and I'm not implying abuse of this here, but if we're looking at it with and you mentioned in the beginning, the county had a comment that to apply this to potentially other smaller sites, I'm looking at from the more global township application so that it is applied as intended to give flexibility and quality development in the township.
I think my reply would be twofold. First, the economics in developing a site like this are massive. And you're not going to utilize a overlay district and come in for a 1% use of the land for residential purposes. It's just not going to happen. If somebody is looking for residential development, they're going to go to a residential district. And if they're looking for the flexibility and they're looking for reaction to the industry where they can mix residential and commercial on a larger site, you're going to take advantages of this type of overlay. And can this be modified? Absolutely. But to the extent we look at this and delay the adoption of this, it might have a significant negative impact, more than Rockville is currently experiencing, to move forward with this. And if the county is recommending, which they are, and potentially the township wants to look at this on other sites, that is a separate amendment, a separate petition, or a separate ordinance that the township advances. And in that situation, the township could say, let's incorporate concept A or concept B. Let's incorporate a mandatory mixed use on sites between blank acres and blank acres. So there are options, and we always can look at modifying it under this scenario or that scenario. But one of the things that we strive to do up front was, one, give us an option, recognize the e-commerce impacts that we were facing then. And now I think it's even more critical between e-commerce and COVID, that there are development options that we'd have the ability to do. And again, adopting this doesn't preclude the township in the future looking at this, modifying it, and making it available for other sites in the township.
Well, and Mark, quite honestly, if you come in with a master plan for this site, or Chris comes in with a master plan for this site that has 1% residential, that's not really going to fly with the board of supervisors.
And to support that comment too, just if we run some quick numbers, with the concern about not enough residential, which is a valid question, running the quick math, since the dwelling units per acre is applied to the entire site, if in theory we said the entire 63 acres, the minimum dwelling units per acre is 4 units per acre, then that's 252 residential dwellings. That would be an absolute minimum. And then, of course, that would be spread across only 40% of the site. But as far as dwelling units per acre being applied to the entire property, you're looking at around 250 dwelling units minimum.
Anything else, Darrell?
Well, Chris just brought it up again, and we've been maybe say dancing around this. So are we saying it's 12 or 4 dwelling units per the 63 acres, or is it 4 or 12 units per the 40% of, is it, dwelling units per acre of the residential gross acreage? So it's not clear here. We could read it either way, I guess, and we're reading it both ways now. So
I don't think there's an ambiguity there. It's 12 units or 4 units per acre over the entire site.
okay.
Correct.
All right.
And then where you can utilize it can be no more than 40% of the site. And so if total 720, again, we felt that the township would not want us to take a C3 district and then take 720 units and put it over the entire 63 acres. If we could maximize the density, we would then look at density between 4 and 12, look at the number of units, townhouse, multifamily, but then only be able to use up to 40% of the site for residential purposes. The remaining is open space, walkways, bike paths, commercial development, parking, the other components of a designed master plan project.
Anything else, Darrell?
And there is no, and I think it was maybe referenced somebody else, there is no minimum or maximum for commercial acreage. There's not a percentage for that. That, in a sense, the controlling factor is the residential use, a maximum of 40. So with that said, there would be, you could have 60% commercial, but you could have 90% commercial and 10% residential, or 80-20 or 75-25. But there's not a 70% maximum or an 80% maximum commercial. We're not saying there has to be some residential. We're saying it could be as much commercial as determined at the time, but no more than 40% residential.
As long as he provides the minimum of 4 units per total acreage. As long as he provides on his 63 acres, as long as he provides
Okay.
the 200 and whatever he came up with number units.
If there's a residential component, you have to have a minimum of density of 4 units per acre.
Right, so you're at 250 units on that 63 acre property at least,
Correct.
and possibly go as high as, I believe the number was 714 or something like that.
Okay.
So somewhere in between. A lot of this is market. I understand Roger's point of, what about garages? Well, what about over commercial? If market value doesn't take it there, the developer has no reason to go there. Part of this, I am sure that 8 months from now, when we're digging the first ditch, and then we look back 4 years from now, the concept has changed partly because of market. They're trying something. We have to give them credit for trying something. They're trying to benefit themselves. They're trying to benefit the township also. I think overall, we're enthusiastic about the project. We're just trying to make sure that we do it right the first time. Anything else, Darrell?
Just to make one point, it's Isaac Mastering.
We can't see you, Isaac.
Again, we're all planning with. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yay.
There you go.
okay, so the point that I just want to make is, as much as we're trying to plan and we're making our estimations on how much residential we're going to have, and how much retail we're going to have, and how much potential medical we're going to have, again, it's just our estimations. And we use as much data as possible that we can work with over the last, I don't know, 6 to 9 months. But again, it's just our estimation at the end of the day, or we know we have to just change out of where we are today. You know, the retail and the amount of percentage rent tenants that we have. It's challenging.
I
So
think us as individuals and as a township, we're appreciative of what you're trying to do. We're just trying to work through everything and come up with the best results for everybody. I have a few comments I'd like to go over. Mark, some of it is just clarification. When we look at the 21060 commercial redevelopment overlay district, when we look at A5, to implement goals, objectives, recommendations of the comprehensive plan, please identify what comprehensive plan. There's 3 of them that actually cover this. The Conestoga Valley, Lancaster County, looking back, I think there's 3 of them actually covered. I'd just like you to, if you have one in particular, mention it. I believe there's some reference to it from county.
I believe that the comprehensive plan is a defined term under your zoning ordinance. Is it not, Tara?
When you're referring to that, it's the Conestoga Valley Comprehensive Plan.
Correct.
We're also under other comprehensive plans. We were joint partners with LIMC, and there's a Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan.
There are multiple layers, and I agree with you, John. It's just that in an ordinance, when we're using the term comprehensive plan, it goes back to the definitions of your ordinance. When we're doing it in the petition, it could have a much broader scope because it could be any one of the 3 that you're referencing.
The township.
To add to that, Mark, in your petition, you specifically referenced the Conestoga Valley Regional Strategic Comp Plan, and then you say comp plan for the short version. So I think that's where John's headed. If you were as definitive in the ordinance as in the petition, I think that would answer John's question.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that you have down what you want. If that's what you want, that's fine.
According to the zoning ordinance, the comprehensive plan is defined as any plan adopted by East Lampeter Township.
That gives us the flexibility as the ordinance does then.
It goes on. It goes on. So it could be interpreted as any plan that the township has adopted.
Well, Mark, that doesn't mean you can pick which one of the plans. You have to comply with all of them. I heard you.
The plan is just a guide for us to follow as we move forward.
I'm just hoping the clarification would help you. Moving on, D, permitted uses. I'm running into the darkness here. A, convenience store. When you say convenience store of 23,200, when you look at it, there's different size convenience stores for different zones. So we should have it clarified as to where you fit.
And the last section of the ordinance, of the draft ordinance, the proposed ordinance, talks in terms of a maximum square footage for the actual building and a maximum square footage for purposes of the canopy. And that was the attempt to make sure that we had a limitation and an identification of those components of the convenience store.
Okay, when you look at the different zones though, they also have a limitation on number of pumps. So you may want to sort this out to figure out how many pumps you want. One of the zones allows 2, one of them allows 4. So there's just a difference that you should identify to start with. On D1B, daycare facilities, commercial, according to the ordinance, there seems to be 2 types, a primary and an accessory. You should identify which one you're thinking of.
John,
Yes,
in regards to the convenience store, the way the pumps work is by the size of the building.
okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Financial institutions, so that's D1D. It seems to be broken down by service lanes. Some of the districts, they can have 2 lanes, some of them they can have 4 lanes. Again, express your choice. So when we put it in the ordinance, you're not fighting it. A was convenience store. G is grocery store. It seems like grocery stores can either be principal or accessory. You should identify which you desire. We get to H, and again repeated in L, your multifamily and your townhouses. You're saying don't bother with 23,490. Just go to the E section down here, and you have 3 things that you have to qualify for. My feeling is you're missing some things. You're missing open spaces, you're missing setbacks between buildings, you're missing distances between buildings. There's a lot to be. I know you need freedom, but I don't want to see you dig yourself in a hole and get the buildings too close to each other. And there's.
But John, we understand that, but the building code on top of everything else is going to dictate what we can do and not do. And right up front, we intentionally did not want to deal with setbacks except as the perimeter setbacks for the site, knowing that we had other land use ordinances that would come into play. And as I think has been said by multiple people on multiple occasions tonight, to the extent we say we're going to have this building separation or that setback, then as soon as we say that, we're going to look to do something else. The building code mandates building separations, mandates how close you can have a building to another, whether it's a straight or it's at an angle. And the flexibility that we want to have in the master plan concept of developing this site is what we're trying to achieve. And so we intentionally said, let's deal with A, B, and C, and then come back with a master plan that would show you what we're proposing to do and how we propose to lay out the site.
Okay, I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just trying to clarify.
Okay.
Parking compound. That's an actual business. Somebody pays to park their car, short-term or long-term. You feel that's a benefit to add to this? It's a business by itself, I'm understanding by definition.
I'll have to double check that, John. We didn't see it as a separate business parking. We saw it as the ability to add another use potentially. And
what would that use be?
As defined by the ordinance.
So a business of charging for parking.
Chris, can you recall the thinking with respect to parking compound?
I thought that came up in conversation, just thinking if we're trying to achieve higher densities, that would allow us to get higher and better utilization of the land to go vertical with parking. It may not happen because obviously it's expensive.
Don't think the term you need is parking compound then, by our definition. Tolerant for a second, let me look it up. Sorry to do this to you. Parking compound, primary business where passenger vehicles may be stored for short-term, daily, overnight, off-street parking, and connects to a street by an accessory drive. Supplemental regulations for parking compound are contained under section 23310 of the zoning ordinance. If that's a business you want to be included, okay, I just want to make sure we understand.
I don't read that as a business, John. I read that as a use. And as Chris indicated, we thought we were, our intent, I won't say we thought, our intent is to include that use as whether it's structured parking, whether it is a parking compound, whether it is multiple levels on it, but to provide that ability and avoid somebody coming back and saying, you don't have the right to put that use on this site.
Okay. Okay, we're just trying to keep each other out of trouble.
That's a great goal.
K, residential retirement and or care facility. Is that in addition to the residential units?
Although it's a residential, I think that's a close call between whether that's a business or whether that's a residential use. Because you have the personal care facilities, although they're residential in nature, they're a commercial operation. So I think that would be in addition to another option that could be provided that the developer or an applicant would have the right to do so.
I'm trying to get clarification now before we get down the road and have a problem.
Okay.
So your thought process through this, it's an additional business on the property.
I see that as a potential additional use that could be put on the property in addition to the residential use, which would be the multifamily use, the townhouse use, et cetera.
We get down to F, regional impact development. Could you briefly describe your thought here?
Regional impact is a concept that is somewhat unique to East Lampeter Township. If there is a certain impact, it triggers a conditional use. And what we're saying and what this ordinance provides is that we want to eliminate the zone step of somehow somebody saying this is a regional impact, therefore you have to go back and get a conditional use. What we're proposing is a by right use of this as an overlay, and specifically from a traffic perspective, that unless what is proposed has more of a traffic impact plus a buffer of 10%, than what originally was contemplated with the initial development, then the regional impact doesn't come into play and you could proceed as a by right use, as opposed to going first and getting zoning approval under conditional use and then proceeding forward with the subdivision land development.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure clarification. Moving on to G, area dimensional and height requirements. Number one, you said you changed from 80% down to 70%.
We did that at the suggestion of staff.
Right. And then at the bottom of that, it says, impervious coverage may be increased above the 70% if the applicant can demonstrate the proposed on-site stormwater facilities can manage the increase in impervious coverage. Increase to what?
With no upper limit, John. I'm pretty radical when it comes to the need for zoning. I used to see the need and the purpose of it, but between the requirements of the building code and now stormwater management, to the extent you can manage the site, to the extent you can deal with the stormwater associated with that site, you should be able to develop it to the utmost. And what we're saying is that the maximum, because you have setbacks and you have to have green and you have to have BMPs based upon stormwater and Chesapeake Bay, et cetera, is if we can manage the stormwater, let us go higher than 70%.
Okay, again, I'm not trying, I wasn't trying to block you. I'm just trying to clarify. In that same section, G, I believe there's typographical errors on the last two paragraphs. It goes 1, 2, 2, 3. Should be 1, 2, 3, 4. Just a mistype.
I'll review that. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.
On that same area in G, it says of setbacks, the front setbacks on the perimeter, but it doesn't say anything about interior front setbacks. You need to spell that out or anything? I didn't see that. Maybe I'm missing something.
No, we intentionally chose not to deal with internal setbacks, knowing that we had building setback requirements associated with the building code. We wanted to do this as a master plan concept. And to the extent you start having internal setbacks, it makes it very difficult to plan otherwise. So as long as we had the perimeter setbacks associated with the overall use, we thought that was the better approach to designing this from a master plan perspective. Chris, is there anything you want to add with that?
No, again, I think when we're trying to achieve certain streetscapes, you might find the buildings up closer to the edge of the street. You might have some 10-foot walkway areas that dictate where that building comes into contact with the streetscape. So that's going to vary quite a bit. But I agree with Mark. You're going to see those separations come in from the building code.
John, back to John's G1, and I thought John was asking a question of how do you define manage, or how do you determine manage? I had first read that that you can demonstrate the proposed on-site stormwater facilities can meet the stormwater requirements. Manage is a much softer, how do you determine, who determines it's being managed as opposed to meeting the runoff requirements, et cetera. I mean, it is, from my perspective, meet would be the word and not manage. That, you can only discharge so much off your site. How do you hold it? How do you use it? Underground facilities, above ground, on surface, but manage is kind of a loose word from a regulatory standpoint, I think, from our side.
From a zoning perspective, I think it's the proper word. The second step would be the subdivision land development, which brings in the stormwater regulations of both the township and the county. And so overall, it's the management of the stormwater, but keeping in mind that what we're dealing with here is the use under the zoning ordinance. And then to the extent the use is permitted, the next step would be both the master plan from a concept perspective, and then the ultimate subdivision land development, which then brings in stormwater management and obviously the compliance requirements that you're talking about.
Okay.
Page 5 of your notes, down at the bottom of section 4. And it's to East Lampeter Township Zoning Ordinance 2016 as amended, section 23, 200D3A, and you're changing the wording on it. It was C1 and C2 zoning districts, and you're adding or the commercial redevelopment overlay zoning districts. You just have a typographical right there. You repeat, or with the C1, C2, you repeated that. So it's just typographical. That's all I had.
I know we're only looking at the Rockville, the development itself, but if we look at this paper here and the west southwest corner there, Bowman Road and Rockville Road is farm. I know that's not part of Rockville, but should that be considered as part of the overlay? Only from looking at it from that standpoint, even though you're not applying for it, should we think about doing that? It just seems like that's a it's just logical.
Dan, that doesn't have an underlying zoning district of C3, it's agricultural zone.
Okay, so we can't overlay it over an agricultural zone then.
The way this ordinance amendment is written is for over C3 zoning district only.
Okay. It just seems like a logical parcel there to be included into that from that standpoint, even though it's a different owner and a different use at this point.
Tara,
Yes.
was there any public comment?
There's no public comment.
Thank you. Any further comment from Planning Commission members?
Just a couple house cleaning or housekeeping on it. On the ordinance, on page 1 under section 1, I think there's a word missing in there. Are you saying the East Lampeter Township zoning ordinance of 2016 as amended, Article 1, Section 1070B, is hereby amended to add the following to the list? Or add the following, the list? Or is there a word missing there? Should to be in there? And if we go to the next page, under C2, and I may be having a brain freeze, is Route 30 US Route 30 or is it a state route? Can somebody help me there?
State
Is-
route.
Is it state route?
Yeah.
It's a state route, okay. I mean, some places here it's been referred to as US route and other places state route. And here it's just a little redundant, SR route, state route 30. So maybe the word could be eliminated, but there's a couple places it's referred to. Maybe that was in the county, I forget where. Referred to as US Route 30. So that's, so state route, thank you. You have it correct. And then one final that I had, if you go to E, the special requirements for residential use, under 2, when you say the minimum residential density within the commercial redevelopment, not development, right? You have commercial development overlay, but it's redevelopment overlay. So you just missed the RE.
Okay.
Just
I'll come back and ask for final comments. We also have Lancaster County Planning Commission. Mark stated the fact that they did have the meeting yesterday. We have a draft copy. Tara, did we get a final copy?
We did not get the final copy, given the timing.
Commentary, the proposed text amendment are consistent with the following places 2040 policies. Creating great places, creating a mix of use in our communities and corridors, providing a greater supply and diversity of housing types to own and rent, connecting people, places, and opportunities, connecting housing, jobs, schools, transportation, and other destinations. Growing responsibility, grow where we've already growing, prioritize redevelopment infill in the urban growth areas. Build more complexity and efficiency. Simplify zoning. The proposed zoning amendment simplifies zoning by incentivizing redevelopment and allowing mixed use in the suburban character zone and along priority corridor as identified by Places 2040. Their recommendations based on the demand for and success of the commercial redevelopment overlay district, the township should consider offering these provisions to smaller shopping centers in the C2 zone. Item 2, any master development plan submitted under the commercial redevelopment overlay district should incorporate the plan recommendations of the 2015 Lincoln Highway Streetscape Plan as it relates to the projected area. That's the report we had from Lancaster County. Are there any other comments or questions from Planning Commission on this subject this evening?
Overall, I think it's a very good idea. And I think it's something we should proceed on. There may be some tweaks to be done, but I think it's something we should give our support to.
Are there any other comments before I ask for a motion? Hearing no comments, Planning Commission is open for a motion.
I'll make a motion that the commercial redevelopment overlay district petition should be forwarded on to the Board of Supervisors for their hearing of July 20th, 2020 at 5 p.m. Based upon everything we've discussed tonight.
Any questions or comments on the motion before us?
Pending the final letter from Lancaster County Planning Commission, which is in the
Okay.
works.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Add that to the recommendation.
We now have a motion before us that Lancaster County Planning was added to. Any questions or comments on the motion before us? Hearing none, I'll look for a second to that motion.
I'll second the motion.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So noted, so passed. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, and Chris.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We thank you for the concept.
Thank you.
We thank you for your enthusiasm. You passed on the enthusiasm to the supervisors. I feel that we want to help you pass that on. This is something that's needed. It's timely. I think we can set a good example. We look forward to working with you through the future of this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As do we. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
New business, 6B.
John,
Yes.
excuse me, if I may make a comment, and this is not part of the motion, which I'm doing it now, but in reference to the county's comment on, based on demand for an excessive commercial redevelopment overlay district, the township consider offering these provisions to smaller shopping centers. I don't know if we want to comment on that. My feeling is that's a good thought, but I think that will take some time to see how this develops. And as this develops, we may want to, it might be good to revisit that issue and see if there are other potential areas to consider, or do we want to wait and see if somebody comes into us and says, hey, why can't I do this? And here's our proposed changes overlay. I'm not sure exactly what the best is. I think we should be proactive, but I'm not sure how we be proactive with something like this on a case-by-case basis, or how do we address that? I don't know. Do we want to make any comment? I think it's worth considering, but I'm not sure how we proceed.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to proceed. I feel first thing we should wait and see how this develops to see if we're on the right track before we compound the situation. I'm not saying compound the mistake, but, oh, that didn't work. Maybe this will work. Maybe something else. If somebody in distress feels that they should have it and it should apply to them, they're welcome to work on it. I think we'll cooperate with them as much as we have. I'm just hesitant to jump ahead and put something else out there when the first one hasn't been proven.
Mhm.
And to my knowledge, we don't have an application for a lesser property right now.
The other limitations we have on it, though, it has to be a minimum of 50 acres and have frontage on Route 30. So that's going to be a limitation right there. And plus the 35% vacancy rate in 6 months. So there's like three limitations right there that someone's going to have to meet before we
Well,
even would consider that.
If somebody meets those, if another property along Route 30 meets those qualifications and the supervisors pass this, if another property meets those qualifications, they can apply for it and use it.
Yeah.
But I think what the county was saying was, we don't think you're gonna find another 50, 63 acre property. But there may be one up the street that's only 34 acres.
Right.
Would you consider doing it for 34 acres?
Yeah, this is going to happen because I'm already starting to get calls on my regular business that I'm working with through an architecture firm that they're hearing that this is happening here through East Lampeter Township and that it's going through, and they're already reaching out to contact me about what's going on, what's the status. So I know that they're going to use this as a template in other places as well as in East Lampeter Township. So we do need to be prepared that this is going to come up for smaller locations down the road. Now, this obviously puts some limits in the short term until we make sure everything is okay, but we need to know that those questions are, and that pressure is going to come eventually.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And I think that's what I was saying, John, what both Dan and you were saying is, I think it's a good comment from the county. I just wanted to note that we're not ignoring it, but we need some additional information, assuming, as you said, the supervisors approve this and how it proceeds, and, you know, learn from this overlay application, assuming it proceeds forward as it's intended today. And maybe we can see other possibilities or react to other requests.
Right. I don't think we would deny help to anybody.
Correct.
We just can't give things away.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. We also got copies of zoning ordinance amendment memo. Our zoning ordinance is supposed to be a floating document. We decided a number of years ago that we would try to. Tara has businesses, individuals, property owners, whatever, come in and ask questions about the ordinance. There's some errors in the ordinance, some omissions, some overlaps. And rather than bother the supervisors every month with one or two things, she keeps track of it. When we get a dozen things or something of importance, she tries to bring a list together. We should review that list, look at it, decide what we want to recommend for it, and then pass it on to the supervisors. Tara went through some time and made up the list, sent it out to us. I had commented in an email to her that some of it seems black and white. There's no question. What do you want to do here? Yes, no. Some of it, you question the point of what were they thinking when they asked for this? They may have something specific in mind, but as outsiders, we're not seeing their side of the story. So we can try to work through it. We don't need an answer tonight. We're trying to prepare this to tell the supervisors that we have the list and we're willing to act on it. There's a couple of them I'd like to go over with, ask Tara some questions so we can get some background, and then we can make some notes, and at a following meeting, we can bring it up again and see if we can clarify any of it.
Now, do you want us to send, after this meeting, do you want us to send any questions or comments that we have or thoughts to you to kind of summarize from everybody?
Actually, what I would really prefer is just to have that conversation now, because I'm going to do the same exact conversation with the board on Monday evening and ask them to set a hearing date.
Okay.
So I'll just start at the top.
Yeah.
Our zoning hearing board members have seen a number of cases come before them for tourist homes, and they are somewhat concerned that we have these tourist homes that are remaining vacant for extended periods of time. If they're not rented, especially now, given the situation. And there are some that the owners solely rent on weekends from, let's say, April until October. So they're really left vacant through the winter months. So that was something that came up, that there be someone living there, whether they rent it in general and then rent out weekends, or whether they live there, something of that nature. That was the first one. The second one was kennel size.
Tara?
Yeah.
With tourists, is there a specific definition for tourist home? At first I was reading this and thinking it was a bed and breakfast. Then I
They are
was
defined differently.
Airbnb, and so what's a tourist home? I didn't look. I mean, I didn't.
You don't know this by the back of your hand?
I don't know the back of my hand. So right now I've been out in the sun, so it's a little red.
The definition of tourist home is a single family detached dwelling where the accommodations are rented for a maximum of 10 overnight guests on a daily basis for a period of time not exceeding 30 consecutive days. Would you like to know the definition of bed and breakfast for comparison?
So it says it has to be a detached.
Yes.
So, okay.
Tara?
One for bed and breakfast.
The definition of bed and breakfast is a single family detached dwelling where not more than 5 sleeping accommodations are rented on a daily basis for a period of not to exceed 14 days. Breakfast may be offered only to those registered overnight guests. Yes, John.
Tara, you're saying that you're going to try to talk to the supervisors next week. As we go over these today, do you want to take item by item and us give you a recommendation?
No, that's not necessary right now. What I would like conversation as to whether or not you feel that's a change that should be made. But there's no recommendation right now because this isn't a formal conversation. The board has not said we're going to go through a zoning amendment this year.
Okay, I have a question on the first one.
Okay.
If you look at section 23110 F1, a tourist home shall be contained within a single family dwelling, detached dwelling, that is either an owner occupied dwelling unit or a non-owner occupied unit.
Right. So one could take this and interpret it in 2 different ways. The first way is that someone has to be in the dwelling, owner or non-owner. And the second way is that there can be someone in the home or there doesn't need to be someone in the home. And that's how that's how the zoning hearing board has interpreted this in cases.
It said owner occupied. How can it be owner occupied when nobody's there? If you're in this room, you're in this room. It doesn't say owned by. Contained within a single family detached dwelling that is either an owner occupied dwelling unit or non-owner occupied dwelling.
Right. So the zoning hearing board has said that can mean the owner lives there or no one lives there.
What does the solicitor say?
That's what the zoning hearing board solicitor says as well.
Can we go to a different source? I
I think that's why we need some clarification, clarifying language in this particular area.
And they feel that, so they're gonna rent the home out to up to 10 people, not to exceed 30 days each, numerous times a year, and then we'll find somebody to live in the house the rest of the time?
That is what the zoning hearing board has suggested.
Why are they suggesting that? What's the issue?
The issue is that the dwelling remains vacant for extended periods of time.
I think they should put a cap on the amount of time that it can stay vacant. Somewhere in there, you have to have that, because there's got to be some flexibility in there where you're not going to have somebody in there, whether that's 2 weeks, a month, or whatever. But to think that you're going to be able to fill that space and then have somebody live in there full time the rest of the time, I don't think that that's going to work.
That would be difficult for zoning officers to enforce.
Well, that was my question anyway. How are you going to monitor this or enforce it anyways? How do you, is someone going out there and checking it all the time?
Yeah, at this point in time, we use the Airbnb to actually find where these tourist homes are. We use that and, you know, the VRBO and the other sources that are out there. Now, quite honestly, over the last 3 months, we haven't been doing that because they haven't been rented.
Is there a way of putting like a percentage of time that it's occupied by someone? You know, it has to be occupied 70% of the time or whatever. So it's not sitting vacant. I think the concern is that these things are sitting vacant, you know, half the year or more.
Dan, do you think you could find somebody to rent a house for 8 months next year? But we're not going to tell you which 8 months. And they won't be consecutive. I see it problematic.
Yeah, that's the owner's problem.
Just because it's on this list or this memo doesn't mean that it has to move forward.
Well, I'm sure.
Would it help them or clarify it if we got a better legal description of occupant?
That's why the suggestion was to have a resident occupy the dwelling when not used as a tourist home.
But then where does that resident go when it is occupied?
I
and
don't
breakfast.
have an answer to that.
I mean, I'm guessing that the owner of that tourist home is maintaining it. I don't know what the issue is, if they're concerned that it's not occupied, but if it's not occupied, especially over the winter, I'm sure they're maintaining it at some level so that it is rentable when the rent time comes. If somebody wants to use it, that it's available. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure what the zoning issue is. With it not
looking for a problem here that's not there, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand what their concern is with the way it is now. It's up to them to rent it. If they aren't renting it, they're not getting any income. But they still have to maintain it. If they're not maintaining it, that's another issue. You know, they have to mow the grass, they have to do this, they have to do that. There's ordinances that address those issues if it becomes an eyesore or inhabitable, you know, or a hazardous structure. But
So is it the Planning Commission's conversation that this particular change maybe should not move forward?
without additional, I think, definition or clarification, as John said, definition of or clarification of what the concern is beyond not being occupied. Not being occupied for a month or two or three, what's the problem? Why
Is
is
it the zoning hearing board's opinion that they just don't want this to happen and they're trying to limit it, or what is their thinking?
I think the general thinking is really to not have as many what they perceive as vacant dwellings throughout the township.
On that same subject, possibly you want to look at table 22160.1. I take it this, I'm looking for name. Anyway, we can have 10 people stay at this place,
That's right.
but it sounds like they need one parking space.
It would fall under the single family dwelling, so 2 parking spaces.
No, they need 2 for the resident that's not there. But each rental unit, they need 1.
Single family detached units require 2 parking spaces.
Yeah, but I think there's something for tourist home.
Oh, I'm sorry. 2 spaces for the principal residential use, not for the residents, but for the principal residential use, plus 1 parking space per rental unit. So they would need 3. Each tourist home would need 3.
Okay, I just wondered how you got 10 people in 1 space.
Okay, if there's nothing further on that, I'll
Moving
move
on.
to kennels. So we've recently seen 2 kennels in the last year come before the zoning hearing board, and it was brought up that the 10,000 square feet allowance for a kennel size is significant. So the question was asked whether or not this could be reduced to 3,000 square feet, but not have that include any type of doggy daycare or, you know, where you drop your dog off for them to run around like they're a child.
I would agree with that. General consensus?
Is this aimed at puppy mills? Is that what they're?
No,
concern?
we've just had some kennels come in and, you know, once they start looking at the size of the kennel and the runs that are associated with them and the noise reduction construction requirements, if you get to a 10,000 square foot building, that's a sizable building. I mean, that's, in comparison, that's about 2 sheets. So think of the size of a sheet. That's about 6,000 square feet. That's a big kennel.
Yeah.
3 sounds good to me.
3,000 sounds good here.
Fine.
Yeah. Yep. 10's a
Okay,
lot.
and then along with that, every time that kennel comes in, they're required to have screening. And for the last 2 kennels, the one made absolute sense because on the side of the farm that the kennel was on, in a distance, there were some residential units. So screening the back end of that made absolute sense. In the most recent one we had, the nearest property was probably 1,000 feet away. So we now have a long farm lane, about 1,000 feet. Then we have the dwelling. We have screening between the dwelling and the kennel, and screening around the kennel. And the next property is another farm. So they've inquired as to whether or not the screening language or landscape buffer language is absolutely needed in every case. And if that can be justified by the applicant as not needed, then it could be removed as a requirement.
I agree with the 500 feet.
Is the screening for visual or for sound?
Both, actually. However, we've had some cases like the first one I talked about where we had a neighbor come in and the zoning hearing board actually required the farmer to provide the specific construction material that would be used in the kennel for soundproofing so that they could make the determination whether or not the buffer would be needed.
So that may be in addition to this, that if sufficient sound proofing or sound barrier is provided, the screening could be eliminated or not required, whatever the proper language is. Because if you're, say, downwind, the sound's going to carry further than if you're upwind.
Right.
And depending on location or down in the valley, if you're in a low area or up on the hills, et cetera, et cetera. But so it could be a consideration for soundproofing. It may or may not be important.
Yeah, the 500 feet might be all right where you're, yeah, from a property line, because it's saying 500 feet from the nearest property line. That might be okay if the next property is a farm or something, but it's 500 feet from the next property and it's a townhouse or something like that, or, well, yeah, just a regular residence. That may not be enough. You may still need screening. I don't know. You get a bunch of dogs barking all at one time, and when you have more than one dog, they probably are barking a lot.
Yeah.
That could be very annoying.
Well, football field and a half or so distance-wise, trying to visualize and how sound carries, but a barking dog carries further.
Yeah. So I'm not sure the 500 is, it's okay for certain areas, but maybe not in all cases. It may not be enough. So it's something you have to look at.
I think Tara had a good example. They had the sound issue was a concern, and that was implemented, and then the screening wasn't.
Okay, we'll look at language that might accommodate.
Part of it may be if they have runs, if it would go
They're
out.
required to.
Well, yeah, but they wouldn't be the whole way around the building.
That is correct.
So face the solid wall towards the nearest property line in excess of 500 feet. And the runs would go out the other direction.
That is one way to design it. Another way to design it would be to have a center hallway, basically, with kennels on either side and runs on either side.
Right, actually, possibly two buildings. A U-shaped building.
It's actually one building, and so you walk down like you would in your home with bedrooms, but kennels on either side, and then outside of that you have your run. Okay, we'll consider other language for that so that it's still looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you.
The signage issue is one that's brought up by a number of businesses in the township on a fairly regular basis. And that's when we have a non-conforming sign and it's damaged to 50% or more. And they have to go back to the zoning hearing board to get that sign back, basically. Now, this was implemented well before my time here as a zoning officer at the township. And the zoning hearing board has used this in some cases, this particular language in some cases, to eliminate signs that were really over the maximum allowances within the ordinance, but were put in place prior to the ordinance requirement. There's the one that I can think of off the top of my head right now is the Country Inn right up here on Old Philadelphia Pike. I believe the sign was hit by a tractor trailer at some point, and they had to come before the zoning hearing board to get the sign back, basically. So it put their sign replacement out at least a month before they could get to the zoning hearing board because of the advertising requirements. Now, there are some cases in which, you know, this would apply to billboards as well. And that would mean that all of the billboards along Route 30, which are now non-conforming uses, could use this particular portion of the ordinance if it were changed to remain where they are.
Yeah, my feeling is that all non-conforming signs should come into compliance at some point. I know we had this situation with the new motel out there, what was it, that kids motel where they had the original sign, and we allowed them to keep that sign even though it was a non-conforming size. I feel that we should, if there's any way we can get these signs to come into compliance rather with our ordinance, that would be ideal.
Any other thoughts?
So I don't like, I've never liked this. I grew up in an insurance household, so so if I had a sign along a road and it was non-conforming because of a law made after that sign was up, and a tractor trailer came and wrecked that sign, my feeling would be that I should be allowed to put that sign back exactly the way it was the minute before that accident beyond my control happened. Windstorm, all that. Now, if I changed the building and everything and I wanted to take that sign down and then that's a different story. But when an event that you had no control over and you had a sign on that property or whatever, my feeling is you should be able to put that sign back exactly the way it was before that event happened.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Roger on that one. I mean, overall, I believe we need to get our signs down to where they need to be within what the parameters are now. But in that situation, if you've got an existing sign and somebody else does something to that sign, not you, and you haven't changed the use at that building or facility, you should be able to replace that the way it was.
If it hasn't been maintained or repaired for a while though, and it's just falling down, what's our policy there? I mean, and they decide, okay, it's just about ready to fall down, it's leaning on its own. Are they allowed to to fix it up and keep it into the non-conforming?
If it's less than 50%, yes.
So what would this amendment do, Tara? If a sign is damaged, they could immediately replace it if it's non-conforming?
They could replace it to what the non-conforming was.
Right. And your last statement here, the township staff does not recommend this amendment be. So even though I kind of heard you say on Old Philly Pike there, they had to wait 30 days. I thought you were making that sound as that was not acceptable, but that's not what this staff is saying. That is what's needed to be done. It needs to be looked at.
I was just giving you an example of one that I was aware of.
Yeah. So
Unless I misunderstood, so in that event, they had to go in front of the zoning hearing board to replace a sign that was there?
That's correct.
because it was non-conforming.
They couldn't replace it exactly the way it was?
That's correct, because it was if I remember correctly, it was within 10 feet of the right of way, and you need to be off of the right of way by 10 feet.
Well, that's
being
an
within-
event that they didn't have any control over.
At the same time, the sign was within the right of way.
Yeah, I think being in the right of way in that case is a determining factor. I can see Roger's point on the other side where maybe it's not in the right of way and okay, it was a perfectly good sign. And yeah, but if it's in the right of way, then it's out of conformance in two respects, size and being in the right of way.
I'm
So I
torn.
would argue that then they could move the sign out of the right of way, but have exactly the same sign that was there before. Because nothing they did created the problem.
I in part agree with you, Roger, but if it had not been within the right of way, it may not have been hit. If it had been properly located. So you're in a sense having a hazardous situation that you're allowing to occur again. You know, it's, you know, if you live in the floodplain and you get your house flooded and you get funding and you rebuild it in the floodplain and then you get flooded, you know, in 5 years and then you rebuild it and it's like, how many times does the sign have to be hit before? I mean, I see, but yes, at the same time, if they moved it back out of the right of way, moved it more than 10 feet out, then would they have the ability to replace it like it was? You know, the same, if it was, now if that was the only non-conforming use and the size-wise it was okay, it's, when do you say yes and when do you say no? There's, each circumstance has its own unique concerns.
So I'll keep this in here and we'll keep that on the memo to move forward.
Have there been many situations like this, Tara? Or is this once or twice a year?
In my time here, I can tell you there's probably been one every other year.
So it's not a significant issue. It's significant to that one person it happens to.
It's significant to the business owners.
Right.
Okay, so the next one is High Associates has asked that we change slightly the definition of farmer's market. And let me tell you what that currently is. It's a very slight change. So currently a farmer's market is a retail sales use where more than one vendor displays and sells general merchandise that is new or used on a regular occurring basis. It goes on to say that it can be indoors or outdoors and that there's supplemental regulations. So the change would be that it's a retail sales use where a vendor or vendors display and sell general merchandise, and all of the rest remains the same. So it's really the number of vendors, because in our definition, it's 2 or more. And here it would now allow one vendor to have a farmer's market. And what High is really looking to do is they're working with an individual farmer to provide a farm stand basically within the business park, but you can't have a farm stand without a farm. So you have to have a farmer's market, but they only have one farmer, not 2. So they're looking to change the definition slightly and then be able to provide that as a use within the business park.
I have a dumb question to start with. What does farmer have to do with this? It's a retail sale.
It is a retail sale
Why we call it farmer's market?
because we have specifically a farmer's market in Bird in Hand. And we used to have one down here in Smoketown.
Right, with multiple things that had natural products with it. But I can take used TV sets, put them on tables outside in a parking lot, and call it a farmer's market?
You very well could.
Thank you.
It's a very
That
little
was not a
market.
blanket permission, John.
John, there's a very little market for tube type TVs in case you were thinking about.
I'm looking for one that runs in kerosene yet, so get rid of the coal.
I mean, as far as the request for the revised definition so that they can have a produce stand on their business park, I don't see an issue with that. Does anybody else? Okay.
I agree, Dan.
Okay, then I'll move on. After beginning the Route 340 corridor study, one of the tasks that I took on was looking at and comparing the C1 Laycock Township zoning ordinance to the Bird in Hand zoning ordinance. So I went through, made a matrix, compared what uses were allowed, both principal and accessory, what our setbacks were, things like that. Went to Frank Howe at Laycock Township. We went through the matrix and we went through, you know, what uses are you happy with in this area? What uses are we happy with within this area? You know, he kind of liked the idea of requiring architectural drawings, you know, or it's under conditional use. So if you recall, the Bird in Hand district is you're allowed these uses if you provide us architectural drawings. And if you don't, you have to go through conditional use. So some of the things to consider is allowing municipal buildings and other public use buildings such as firehouses as a use by right within the district. And this is reiterated below because that is not something that is currently allowed within every district in East Lampeter Township. And it's probably something that we really should change so that we can, when needed, put municipal facilities where they're needed. And that would include both the fire houses, municipal buildings, public works, PD, any of those types of structures. The other consideration is allowing nursery or garden centers by right within the district. Now, this is something that we would want to pay special attention to, and we really want to look at something more like a Ken's Garden or Roar's seed kind of facility rather than the Home Depot.
Ken's Garden is actually classified as a greenhouse.
Home Depot is classified as a greenhouse?
No, Ken's Garden is. I just found that out yesterday from Jim Glick.
Yes, they are as a commercial greenhouse. Then the other thing is to consider allowing places of worship by special exception. Right now we allow them by right. That's something that Laycock Township allows by special exception. And so because they really wanted to make sure that the traffic flow was okay wherever they were proposed in the C1. And then theaters and auditoriums by special exception. And any restaurant over 250 seats by conditional use. So currently our zoning ordinance doesn't limit the number of seats of a restaurant anywhere because the intent was that the lot size, the parking requirements, the stormwater requirements would limit the amount of seats that could actually be within a restaurant in any given district in the township. So as you can imagine, they're looking at because majority of the family restaurant, the Bird in Hand family restaurant is within Laycock Township, that's what they were looking at in particular. Any thoughts on any of those?
Remind me, Tara, what's the difference between special exception and conditional use?
Special exceptions have ordinance requirements that are written down that the applicant needs to meet, and they're within the ordinance. That goes before the zoning hearing board. Conditional use goes before the board of supervisors, and that's quasi-judicial, just like a zoning hearing board is. However, the board of supervisors can impose conditions on that use that make sense for that particular use.
Okay.
Those conditions don't have to be written down within the zoning ordinance.
Thank you.
Really, you can think of the special exception as a by right use with additional conditions that the applicant knows up front.
Determined by the zoning hearing
That's
board.
correct. No, determined by the zoning ordinance.
Or the zoning ordinance, excuse me.
That's right.
Tara,
Yes.
the five that you mentioned,
Yes.
right? I would agree with all of them if we put subject to the provisionals, the provisions specified for the use in Article 23 supplemental regulations.
So requiring architecturals.
So whatever the supplemental regulations are for the municipal buildings, yeah, allow them by right. But they have to, they're subject to that they would be in any other zone. In the same way with the nurseries, places of worship and schools, theaters and auditoriums, and we have supplemental regulations for all of those.
In addition, John, the bird in hand has
Design criteria,
design gut criteria that would also need to be met.
yes.
Does anyone have heartburn about any of them?
No.
Okay, then moving through, as you all are aware, we went through the comprehensive planning process for both the Growing Together and Conestoga Valley over the last few months. And going through that process, we found a number of other things that we should consider. As I mentioned before, the municipal facilities allowed by right in the zoning districts. Adding a maximum height for extended stay hotels equal to that of the other hotels within the various zoning districts. As of right now, the ordinance is written that there's no maximum height for extended stay hotels because they are defined differently than a regular hotel. We would look to reword structures, accessory structures, or principal structures on a farm property, and farm meaning 10 acres or more. In the agricultural zoning district and in many of the zoning districts where farm properties are allowed, if a structure is proposed, it has to be 15 feet back from the front facade of the dwelling. Well, as you all are aware, our farms are not set up like that. The barn is out front. There's a milking barn. There's a there's you know, a dairy barn. There can be a feed
Tobacco.
warehousing area. There's spring houses. There's multiple facilities and structures within that you go through first before you get to the house on most farms. So all of those have at this point come in for a variance of that. We're just seeing more and more of this, and it's just something that we're rethinking. Why is this necessary?
Right.
We are looking to remove auto repair within the Village General. This was an oversight when we developed the district that was to be removed from the district in a prior amendment. We want to delete any reference to gardens. So when the ordinance was first being developed, oh, I don't know, John, 15 years ago, there was thought that we needed to regulate individual gardens on properties. So we removed that when we got to the last steps in 2016, but it seems we didn't remove every reference to it. So that's what that's about. We have regulations for fencing, and it's fairly innocuous until you want to put fencing up in a front yard. So you can't have fencing that's above 3 feet in a front yard if it blocks a clear sight triangle or if it blocks an intersection. So what we're running into is in agricultural districts or other districts where farms are located and they have livestock fencing along the frontage or road frontage of the property. That fencing is typically between 4 and 5 feet high. Now, when you're running, when you're running that fence along the frontage, you're typically not interfering with a clear sight triangle or with a intersection, even a farm lane intersection. We do have some farmers, or excuse me, we do have some residents that now have or need livestock fencing for their horses for transportation. And those particular fences are coming into issues with meeting the clear sight distance or the intersection requirements. Now, those fences are typically post with a wire to keep the horse within, and it's usually 3 bands of wire and a post. So we've been asked by the board to take a look at changing that guidance or regulation within the zoning ordinance. So that's what number 6 is about. Number 7, when we have a mixed use building, right now the zoning requirements are such that the owner of the property must run the business in the first floor in order to be allowed to have the 2 apartments above. And I think that this was initially set up this way so that there was someone on site that could handle the apartments and if there were any needs. However, that's just not the case and not what we're seeing in general. So we really want to take a look at having a building that's allowed to be rented out fully with a commercial use on the bottom and 2 residential apartments on the top. There are some reference issues, and this is really just a typo, which is number 8. Number 9.
Tara,
Yeah.
number 8,
Yeah.
the next page has a similar mistake.
Okay. I'll
There
note that.
are 2 charts. It references the title at the top, and then down halfway, it gives you the wrong number, and it repeats it on item 2.
Thank you. Number 9 is RRTA, or whatever name they go by right now, South Central Transit maybe. They have asked for advertising within the bus stops that we have for a number of years. And we've really been balking against it. And now I think we're at the point where we may be able to allow some advertising within these. And part of that may come from the Route 30 Streetscape project because it calls for specific types of bus stops. And there's varying degrees of bus stops. Some are just concrete pads, some are full-fledged bus stops with a shelter. So there was a request to put in some advertising allowances within a transit stop. Now, this was fairly specific that it could be permitted on exterior panels, as long as those panels weren't the panels from the direction in which the bus was coming, because we want those panels to be able to, for the bus driver to actually see if there's people within that shelter. Now, I know they make all these really cool graphics that you can see through on one side and you can actually see the advertising on the other side, but we felt that for the safety of those within the shelter and for the bus driver to see who he or she is stopping for, that this would be the best option. Moving on, we saw the request for the variance of side yards for the twin manufactured home park models that High brought forward to the zoning hearing board. And you saw that with the Zook Yoder Esch land development plan, in which they have both single manufactured dwellings and these twins, where the garage actually meets up for these twin dwellings, and there's firewalls between the garages and then firewall between the garage and the manufactured home. So that we felt that's the trend in this particular market, and we felt that this was a good trend to keep. So we wanted to take that into account and have 0 side yard setbacks for those. There is a typo in Article 25. And then from the design guidelines for the Bird in Hand district, we want to remove any requirements that are put in there for curb and sidewalk. And that's because those types of requirements really belong in the Saldo, and that's where they're at. So Nate's Auto, who you saw before you last time, actually had to seek variances and modifications to have that curb and sidewalk deferred. Then the last two are things that, as we go through, we had the CV middle school come through, and it was questioned whether or not we really should separate grade and high school uses from college and trade school uses. So some of those are allowed, or excuse me, they're allowed within industrial zones. And then we just had the Zook Yoder Esch come before you not too long ago, and that included Thaddeus Stevens, which is a trade school. So the business park at this moment could allow both grade and high schools and trade or colleges. So I think we need to reconsider whether or not those should all be lumped together. I understand they're all schools of some nature, but we have very different pupils going to those schools. And then something that's come up most recently is allowing potentially food trucks within residential districts. And the Board of Supervisors is actually looking at a change to the transient retail business ordinance that the township has and is run through the police department to allow food trucks within residential districts for, I think it's a food truck can come into the residential district every 2 weeks. You know, obviously a food truck's going to come into a residential district if it has patrons. Over the pandemic and the stay in place situation, people were looking for other options because they got sick of their own cooking, I think. And the food trucks hit a few of the residential neighborhoods, and it was a real hit with them. So because there were limited opportunities, I guess. So that's something that the board is looking at on Monday night.
But they wouldn't be able to park there indefinitely and serve?
No, they would be, there's, the way the ordinance for the transient retail business is written is they would have 4-hour increments, because there is some setup time and cooking and then actual sales time and cleanup time. So
Yeah, because like in the city, there's that food truck that's permanently parked on what, King Street coming out of town.
Yeah, that would not be allowed by this ordinance.
And that wouldn't be, I mean, that's been there as long as I can remember, and it doesn't move. I don't know if it can move.
So currently, right now, food trucks are not allowed in residential communities, even if they're only there for 4 hours or less?
If they're there, Dan, if they're there on a roadway, the zoning ordinance plays no part whatsoever. It's strictly the transient retail business through the police department. Now, what the current transient retail business permit requires is background checks on each person that's there in that food truck.
Would they be allowed to set up every day, or is this on a?
No, there would be a limit as to how many times within a period of the month that they'd be allowed there.
Do we have a definition of food truck?
That's within the transient retail business.
And what about soft ice cream that used to come around every day?
The ice cream truck, the ice
Yeah.
cream man, that would be considered a food truck
And you'd only be allowed every 2 weeks.
within a particular neighborhood.
But you're saying if they're on the street, it doesn't apply.
In the transient retail business ordinance, there's still a limitation as to how often they can come around.
Okay. And food trucks are allowed in other districts now?
They would not be allowed in other districts except where restaurants would be allowed. But that's under the zoning ordinance, that's if they're parked on a property.
Okay. So restaurants are allowed in commercial industrial areas?
I'm sorry, Daryl, there was a breakup there.
I said food trucks are not allowed in commercial or industrial, or are they?
At this point, we have not pulled food trucks into the zoning ordinance specifically. If they're considered a restaurant, they'd fall under our temporary retail permit for zoning if they're parked on a property. And that's what occurs at Tanger and Rockvale with like the Annie Ann's food trucks. And there's a gal that has a kosher food truck up at Rockvale. Typically for the year, she buys the permit and is up there almost every weekend. And there's a couple others because they have these food truck events at these retail places. So they would be allowed there if they have the temporary business permit. Now that's two separate permits I talked about. One is through zoning because they're parked on a property, temporary retail, and the other is transient business. That's through the police department. In order to be there, they have to have both if they're on a property. If they're in the street, they just need the police department.
That was a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be.
Wait, just that one or all of it?
That last one, I didn't think it was a big deal for food trucks to drive around and park for a little bit and then leave.
So, you know, a lot of people may think that it's not a big deal in general, but that if we think about food trucks and brick and mortar restaurants, the brick and mortar restaurants are paying taxes here in the township and not necessarily the food trucks.
Back to number one under that, allow municipal facilities by right in all zoning districts. Should we be listing, I mean, what facilities we'd be talking about? It could be, yeah, I don't know what all the township facilities might be. It could be a sewer pump set up in a residential neighborhood or something like that. Do we need to list them?
And they are listed in the definition as recreation, parks, swimming pools, golf courses, spectator sports, municipal offices, police stations, sanitary sewer disposal and treatment facilities, water supply and treatment facilities, utilities, community centers, solid waste disposal areas, recycling centers, composting facilities, road materials and equipment storage, and similar governmental and municipal uses.
Say that could be a problem like composting and that type of thing in a residential neighborhood or something. I can see that being allowed in an agricultural area. I don't know, the one over like a Manheim Township, I don't know, their composting facility is not close to any residential. And I could see a need for that, maybe even East Lampeter, but I wouldn't want it in my backyard.
Kara, on that one, should we add subject to the revisions specified in Article 23?
I think they all, any of these that do move forward with changes would need subject to those
Okay,
provisions.
okay. The third one about the farm property, such structures can be in front of the dwelling.
Yes.
Do we have a minimum? Shouldn't it be 40 feet? Because the farm structure is possibly not in compliance now. And you're not put another structure in front of it?
Well, they'd still have to maintain the front yard setback, but this is yet another setback that's required from the front facade of the dwelling.
Okay, but they still have to stay 40 feet back.
They still have to meet the front setback, yes.
Okay, okay.
On 13, the only thing is that grade school and high schools should be looked at differently from college and trade schools. I can see, you think about grade school and high schools being an asset to a neighborhood where college, may or may not be. I'm not seeing, I don't think we ever see a great big college or something like F&M going there, but a lot of people aren't going to want, college kids living in properties next door to them in a residential area necessarily. No, I don't see that happening, but at the same token, we need to look at them as different uses in a sense.
Was there a need to join the two?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think. Is there a benefit to doing that?
Well, they're currently joined in the zoning ordinance. And quite honestly, that was a leftover from the prior zoning officer's days of trying to push the zoning ordinance forward.
Up to 12th grade and after 12th grade, you're looking at two different patterns. You're looking, under 12th grade, you're looking at school buses, 8 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yes.
You're looking at 11th and 12th graders possibly driving. You're looking at after school activities somewhat, yes. So you have traffic in the morning at 8, you have traffic in the evening or in the afternoon. When you go to a college down at Bridgeport, all hours of the day and night, you have students coming in and out. You don't have 30 students on a bus. Lancaster Bus does service that. There are a few that use it, but most of the time the parking lots are full. So you have constant traffic. So I think there is basic difference between the two types of schools.
I agree. Any other comments?
Comment. Section 23,450, manufacturing. B, it starts off the chart containing under section 23,450, but then the next line it references 23,440. So typographical.
I'll add that to the list.
I think the time spent has been worth it. We're clarifying different things. We appreciate the fact that the work Tara puts into it and the supervisors looking after it. We have to be supportive of each other. They've shown support to us, and Tara has exceeded all expectations, and the support for the supervisors and for us is greatly appreciated. Is there any more on that subject, Tara?
No, sir.
Item 7 was briefing items. There's none at this time. Item 8 was other business. LUAB canceled for the month of June. Announcements, again, please fill out your census form for the 2020 census.
And
Is there
also,
any other business?
yes, please take the Route 340 and Bridgeport surveys, which are at the bottom of the homepage. And please tell your friends, your family, your neighbors, the person you meet at the grocery store.
Eric, just quick on that topic with Bridgeport.
Yeah.
In the previous, I guess, meetings, they actually had plans of the different options they were considering to do there as far as extending roads, connecting things. I didn't see any of that on that survey.
Yeah, not on this particular survey. So, you know, the intent was to have an open house back on April 1st. And obviously that didn't happen. So as soon as we're allowed to have an open house, we do plan to have one and invite the general public to see what, you know, at that last one, we had, I think, 10 different options for that intersection. And that's really been narrowed down. So this survey was to get a feel for pedestrian, bicycle connections that should be needed, because there's been a lot of interest in getting the Greenway Trail along the river moving.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Anything else, Tara?
I have nothing further.
There was a interesting article in one magazine we get from the from the township's magazines about sign ordinance. How's our sign ordinance? Is it updated from that standpoint? And we're talking about like political signs and that type of thing.
Yes, our ordinance has not been updated since the court case, because that court case is still somewhat controversial.
Okay, I just wondered about that. It was a really good article in that magazine about having your solicitor review it and everything. Yeah.
If that's something you'd like me to add to this memo, I'm happy to do that.
Well, it's something that maybe I don't know if the township is looking at that, but I think if we should be looking at it if we're not, if it's our ordinances and up to date, and we could get into a problem or something with that. They talk about suits, being sued and things like that. Just another question. Keystone Homes up there has a notice up there on Horning Road. What's that about?
That is the conditional use that is happening June 15th at 5 o'clock here in this building for the alternative water supply, because they will not be using City of Lancaster water for the remainder of the dwellings and commercial property or uses that will be built in that development. They were permitted by DEP to have a well with a holding tank as potable water.
And just one other thing, the paper, East Hempfield is, I guess, amending their ordinances, reducing density in some of their developments versus where we're trying to increase density. I was wondering if our supervisors or someone should maybe write a letter and say maybe they should reconsider that. And they're just as a recommendation. I know it's out of our purview, but they seem to be going the opposite direction that we are.
If the Planning Commission as a whole feels that that should be a request to the board, then I'm happy to make that request.
All those in favor say aye and raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Is a
Right.
question.
You
Question.
got 5 out of 5 or 6 out of 5.
Is that township part of the what, LIMC or the LUAB?
They were, but they developed their own comprehensive plan most recently and have not been a part of LUAB or LIMC.
Because I was going to suggest they should comment on it, but if they're not part of it, they're not going to, have any.
Well, the county planning commission commented on it. I know they did, according to the paper, but sounds like the township's going their own route. That's all I had tonight.
Hearing no other business, we'll look for a motion to adjourn.
Was rec plan done, Tara? Sorry, John.
Is what done?
The rec plan, is that finalized yet?
Yes, actually, the resolution to accept the plan will go before the board on Monday evening. The school district will have that resolution before them on Monday evening as well. Upper Lake Hawk Township is looking at the resolution at their next meeting as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And hearing no other business, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved.
We have a
Motion.
motion before us. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Moved and seconded. We are now adjourned. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Very productive evening.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Same.
Care.